the greatest hitters in the history of baseball fail 7 out of 10 times. Tom Brady always tells me, he's like, it's not the 7 Super Bowls that I won, it's the 3 Super Bowls that I lost, from which I learned the most. And that's a common theme you see with even the greatest.
Yeah.
I'm working with Serena Williams. She's, she went to 34 Grand Slam finals. It's the 11 that she lost that she thinks about the most, and taught her the most. And she always says, if it wasn't for those 11, I wouldn't have won the 23.
Mr. Gotham Chopra, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we have a long history here on this show of the interconnection between culture, popular culture, history, creativity, entrepreneurship, and I would just say peak performance. And a big part of that is I think we all want to be the best versions of ourselves. And there are a handful of places culturally where this is very, it's put on display,
Sure.
I would say, very publicly. And one of those is the arena of sports. And this is a huge piece of your background. That's where I want to start today. But before we do, I'm wondering if you can take just 90 seconds and for the folks at home who may not be familiar with your work in and around
Sure.
sports and peak performance, tell us a little story about your background and what interests you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So name is Gotham Chopra. I'm a filmmaker by background. I'd say I'm really a storyteller. And, I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm first generation American, which means I'm the first person in my family ever born outside of South Asia. And, for me, growing up in a place like Boston, where sports was, it's a hotbed for sports, it was sort of like a language, I would say. It was how I assimilated. It's how I became American. I became a huge, Celtics and Red Sox and Patriots and Bruins fan. Ironically, like during my the 80s, when I was sort of like becoming a teenager, they were all pretty. The Celtics were great, but sort of tinged by tragedy. There was Len Bias, who passed away, Reggie Lewis, Larry Bird retired prematurely, but everyone else was pretty terrible. But there was something about that sort of suffering, that shared suffering, especially the Red Sox, the Patriots, that I think sort of bonded me. I went to high school where sports was a big part of the sort of, culture and fabric. And, I think that's where I got my first taste of what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. I used to go to places like Fenway Park and Boston Garden, like veritable cathedrals, in the religion of sports. And so that's, when I sort of really fell in love with sports. Later in life, I became, a reporter. I did a lot of stuff. I studied English in college. And I think, what I've done for the last 10 years or so is sort of bring those together, the culture of sports, but also storytelling. It's not just been me. I remember now going back 10, 12 years or whatever, when 30 for 30 launched. And, suddenly there was this thing where you could be a sports fan or a lover of sports and a storyteller or a filmmaker. These things live together, because before that, I would say they were like two separate things. Like sports is what I did in my personal time. And meanwhile, I was like a storyteller or a filmmaker over here. 30 for 30 helped bring them together because, people like Spike Lee and Barry Levinson and all these amazing filmmakers were doing them. So that's when I really was like, oh, I can do this. And since then, I've built this company and really just immersed myself and been really fortunate to work with some amazing talents, from starting with Kobe Bryant, probably the most iconic first, and maybe still most iconic athlete I've ever worked with. And I would say that became a catalyst for me, my career and creatively. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So many of the things everything you talked about, entrepreneurship, storytelling, peak performance, which I'm fascinated by. I also have a background. I sort of buried the lead. My father's Deepak Chopra, and I grew up in Massachusetts, sort of around that as well, like the spirituality world. So the convergence of sports and spirituality is peak performance, and that's the area that I'm really fascinated by.
Well, your documentary work is second to none. So impressive, as you mentioned, Kobe Bryant. But you're leaving out folks like Tom Brady when you did Tom versus Time, and LeBron
Yeah.
James, and Steph Curry, Simone Biles, Alex Morgan, Usain Bolt. I mean,
Yeah.
that is a list of clearly
Yeah.
many of the best athletes in the world. And was your initial attraction to storytelling through the lens of sports? Was that separate? Was it a vehicle to get at peak
Yeah.
performance? Was it this convergence of your background in spirituality,
Yeah.
for example, and how we find our way as humans? If I'm not mistaken, there's a quote in the front of the book, which we will talk about here in a second, but there's a Tom Brady quote about spirituality. I'm going to read it just for a second. Spirituality means a lot of different things to different people. For me, it's your deepest purpose. I do want to know the whys of life. I want to know why we're here, where we're going, trying to find the deeper purpose. To live it through sports in a very authentic way makes so much sense to me. Having these dreams and goals and aspirations and waking up and putting in the work and miracles happening and all of this magic that sports creates. And I'm in the middle of it. I get to live that through sports. Sew this all together, this fabric for me. Like, how did you get into it? Which is the lens that you first put on it?
Yeah. So, again, my background growing up in Massachusetts, my dad and, him sort of having both, I would say a personal, but then professional transformation in the world of spirituality. He was a physician by background. And probably when I was a teenager, started to have his own, life transformation and started things like, meditation, practicing that. And so I started to get exposed to it then. But I would say, ironically, when I graduated from college, which is going way back now. But my first job was I sort of ran away from that world of spirituality, or at least I thought I was. I was a reporter. I worked for a company called Channel One News, which broadcasts in schools all over the country. It was a news network, and I really demanded, I would say, I wanted to cover conflicts. I wanted to go where what I thought was like the least spiritual places in the world. So, war zones like, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Chechnya and Colombia, it was just like crazy places. But you know what I found there? One, like two things I'll say is like, one, you found young people, probably even younger than me at the time. I was in my 20s, but like, younger than me who were fighting wars over grievances that their ancestors, these religious feuds and ethnic feuds and stuff like that. And there's actually something which a whole different discussion, but like deeply spiritual about that. It's like, this thing inside of you, this thing that you've inherited, this thing that you feel so, agonized over. But what the thing I found there there were two things that you could talk about in war zones, like amongst enemies: sports and music. Those were the two things that everybody sort of laid that back then. You could talk about Michael Jordan, you could talk about David Beckham, you could talk about the Bad Boys, and people would everyone had an opinion, and that was sort of interesting to me. And so I think, flash forward however many years, a decade later, when I met Kobe Bryant, and I noticed in him, in talking to him, that this was a guy for whom sports was a vocation. It wasn't, he was like devoted to his craft. His craft just happened to be basketball, but he brought so much to it, and I had observed that in my father and other people in that world. There was just a sort of commitment and a vocation, like I said. And you mentioned Tom Brady. Like, then after Kobe, I started working with Tom. I got to know him personally, and I really just Tom was interesting because I grew up a huge Patriots fan, but I was definitely on the congregation side. I was a fan. I was a person who sat in the stands and watched him and kind of witnessed all the miracles that he created. And it was sort of interesting to talk to him because he was on the other side. He was sitting in the middle of, the citadel, so to speak. And, but we sort of shared a common language. We shared an experience of, what happens in sports at the highest level, peak performance is everything sort of slows down and everything becomes one, and the athlete and the observer sort of become one in moments, stuff like that. And so I don't know, it just sort of like that was my fascination. I am a huge fan to this day. Like I, watch games. I'm a diehard Celtics fan, etc. But like I look at sports through the lens of storytelling. The types of stuff that I and my, colleagues do is sort of, we like to think, elevated and premium, and like, it's less concerned with what's last night's score and more like what's the bigger picture. We always sort of joke around as like, actually our audience is the non-sports fan. If we can get somebody who's like, and I get this sometimes, especially like with some of the Tom Brady stuff, people say to me, oh, I don't like football because it's too violent and the head injuries, and or like, I'm a Steelers fan, man, I hate Tom Brady, like, but I watched that piece and you know what, like, I was inspired. I made my kids watch because it's bigger than sports, and some of the lessons you just read, from the opening of the book, like they're, you don't have to be an athlete to understand, what a lot of athletes talk about when they're talking about sacrifice and resilience. The reason we put our kids in, sports programs is not because we think they're going to become Tom Brady or, Serena Williams or Steph Curry or whatever. It's because they're going to learn really important life lessons about failure. The greatest hitters in the history of baseball fail 7 out of 10 times. Tom Brady always tells me, he's like, it's not the 7 Super Bowls that I won, it's the 3 Super Bowls that I lost, from which I learned the most. And that's a common theme you see with even the greatest. Yeah. I'm working with Serena Williams. She's, she went to 34 Grand Slam finals. It's the 11 that she lost that she thinks about the most, and taught her the most. And she always says, if it wasn't for those 11, I wouldn't have won the 23. So, those are the types of things that I think I'm fascinated by. Like, what are the life lessons that are sort of embedded in the world of sports?
One of the things that you said a moment ago was around sort of like the sort of the obsession for the craft. And I, not to your degree, but as a lifelong photographer and filmmaker, I've also worked with many of the great photographs, Serena several times for, pretty intimately for ad campaigns where you have to hit the tennis ball a very specific sort of way to the layout. And the same is true with, Travis Rice or, any number of the best athletes in the world. And there's something, my experience with, being that close to the people who are, are literally the best in the world, Kelly Slater or Serena as examples, like there is a different frequency. There is a different je ne sais quoi that I find very difficult to put my finger on, but it's very common at that level of athlete.
Yeah.
I think the same is true for, many of the greatest entrepreneurs or many of the greatest artists. And I'm wondering if in your, studying these folks as closely as you have, can you put a finger on that thing? What is the thing that unites them other than just a passion for excellence and a desire to be great at their craft? But you hinted at it earlier. I'm just wondering if we can go deeper there. What is it? What do you feel like?
I think there's a couple things. And I think, there's things like all of them in my, they obsess over things for sure. The process, it's the small details. But, there's also, it's the chip on the shoulder. Tom Brady, up until the very end, thought of himself as the 199th pick. He always found little things to mentally almost like play tricks on himself, like to convince himself that he was sort of the underdog. Serena Williams, who, by all accounts is the greatest ever.
Greatest ever.
In her mind, she always thought, no, like I'm, on the outside looking in. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm the little girl from Compton. Nobody wants me here, and they sort of play these mental tricks on themselves to challenge themselves because, especially when you get later in your career and when you are kind of established as the GOAT, you have to find, the repetition is hard. Like that's what all these athletes athletes talk about is just like the boredom. Like, how do you keep at it? How do you keep doing the same thing? And so you have to find ways to sort of challenge yourself. So I'd say that's one thing. Like they have this gift, of LeBron James to this day, like he hears all the comparisons to Michael Jordan, people who sort of say, oh no, he hasn't reached that level. And so he's constantly challenging himself. I think, Steph Curry grew up. He was the kid who was too small. Oh, his dad was, in the NBA. He was, born with the silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't get into the big time colleges. He had to go to Davidson. He dropped in the draft. Like, these are the stories, they sort of tell themselves to keep on challenging themselves. But I'd say that's one thing. And then the other thing is actually not mystical or whatever. It's they do the work. They do the work. All those people I just listed, if you ask them, like, what's the quality that differentiates them from everyone else, because when you get to the pros, like, everyone's talented, everyone is elite, everyone is gifted. So what is the quality that really separates them? They'll all say, oh, it's my will, it's my mental toughness, it's my ability to keep on going, it's my ability to get up, when failure, to be resilient. Serena said to me, I said, what's the thing that differentiates you from everyone else? And she said, oh, it's my will to work. She's like, I can't tell you how many times I woke up in the morning not wanting to go out and hit balls, practice. I also can't tell you a single time that I didn't. I just, it's like, that's it. It's the work ethic, and it's just like that unwillingness. I used to go to training sessions with Kobe Bryant at 4:30 in the morning. He just was like, that's just the way he was wired, and it was different, and that's what differentiated him from everyone else. So I think a lot of times we get caught up in because I am obsessed with like peak performance and flow state and being in the zone, and certainly that's the product, but part of the formula is just going the repetition and doing it over and over and over and over again. I was with Tom Brady, I think, he was in like year 17 or 18, like so far into his career, had won so many Super Bowls, is obsessed. He's in the back of his house. This is when he lived in Brookline, in his backyard, I think in April. This was like literally weeks after he had orchestrated the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history when, the Patriots came back against the Falcons and won the Super Bowl. We're weeks later, and he's in the backyard with a helmet on and shoulder pads, with his dog running around, like trying to sort of, perfect his throwing motion. He just wasn't satisfied. It was like, oh, there's still more. There's more for me to achieve. I can still perfect this, and it's like, it's a mad scientist, and I also sort of found that fascinating.
One of the things, again, having been around a lot of folks like this throughout my career as an artist, and certainly here in the show, you get to pick people's brains, and the show's now, I think, 14 years old. A lot of people ask, like, wow, what's it like? What are these people like? What's it like to be, hitting balls with Serena, or shooting hoops with Kobe or whatever, or what's it like hanging out? And those personalities, and to be that good, there is something. I don't want to. It's just different. And you talked about the work. You talked about the talent, the gifts, the raw genetics. Those things are a product of it. But as you said, also, everyone at that level is elite. But one thing that I do not see at that level, and I want you specifically to comment on this, for, against, neutral, whatever. But there isn't balance. Obsession and balance don't actually. They don't go together. And while it's natural, and we talk pretty openly in our culture, and about harmony, for example, your father speaks at length about balance and harmony, and yet I do not have the experience being that close to greatness of balance and harmony, and a lot of these things that are typically envious, or we are enviable towards those things in culture. So, and yet we love these people. Yeah, because they're great. So I'm wondering if you can, sure, what are some of your insights around that? Can you reconcile those things?
No, I mean, look, I think you see it often. There's a consequence to greatness, and oftentimes that's imbalance. That is greatness on the pitch or on the field or on the court, and stress and agony off of it. It's well chronicled. Kobe Bryant's indiscretions. Like, he was great. He won 5 championships. He's an all-time guy. His life early in his life anyway, off of the court was difficult. Tom Brady, like, look at, his personal life. Like, it is difficult. It is, because in order to achieve that type of greatness, you got to be all in. You have to do the work. You have to show up constantly. You miss birthday parties and anniversaries and all that sort of stuff. And that has a consequence, And one of the things I always sort of admired or observed with Kobe is, like, he wanted to be great no matter the cost. It's worthy of admiration. I don't know if I envy it. I don't know if I want it, but, and then, you see, like, Steph Curry is an example of, like, he's probably as balanced as anyone I've ever seen, like, he's elite and, greatest shooter of all times, in my opinion. He's also, he's pretty stable, pretty stable. He's a good dad, he's got a strong marriage, all that sort of stuff, but it takes constant work, and I think it's hard. But I think it's also what, we all want to be happy in our personal lives, but it's a huge challenge. And sometimes, Michael Jordan is an example, and I don't know Michael personally, but, like, having watched The Last Dance and observed and talked to a lot of people, he's the GOAT. And yet, his life is challenged. His personal life is challenging. So it is something, I think a lot of them, later in life also, get on these quests to try to find that balance. And oftentimes it's after their careers. I spend a lot of time with Tom right now, and Tom's still, he's only like 45 years old. I think that's the other thing, in athlete terms, you get to your late 30s, God forbid you reach 40, and it's like you're ancient. But in human terms, you're still pretty young. You still have, like, as they say, the back nine to go. And so there's still a lot of life lessons, still a lot of time to sort of find that balance. And I think it's become a lot more part of our cultural vernacular to talk about things like mental health in sports and, finding balance and stuff like that. Whereas before, the generation of the Toms and the Kobes and the Serenas was like, mental toughness, just put that aside. Don't, confront your weaknesses. Don't talk about any of that. Just bury it. And I think we're sort of in an era where actually, you can talk about, like, mental health. You can talk about, like, the cost sometimes of that obsession and try to find that balance.
Yeah. I think that's part of what interests the listeners for our show is they want to be great. And, I consistently wrestle with answering the questions that I get from the community around, like, want to be great. And, what are the secrets, the keys, the insights? And it rarely involves balance. I'm an advocate of harmony, which is, if you've got, what is it, 4 burners and it's work, home. I don't remember what the 4 burners are, but you can really only tend to 1 or 2 pots at the same time, not all 3 or 4. And so if you go deep on one thing for a while, you got to be able to shelve it and then be super present on the other thing. It's more of harmony rather than all 4 pots sort of simmering nicely. I just never see that. And I love the point that you brought up about how, culturally, I think there's an increased awareness that these folks are human. Historically, think of the phrase "shut up and dribble." It's like we did not want to hear from athletes, and yet today we see them have, platforms where they get to advocate beyond just playing their sport.
Yeah.
What is your sense of the role that athletes have? You've got a chapter in the book, moral codes, through the lens of morality. Is there an obligation if someone is great at sports and has the spotlight on them to somehow be a great human? And are we asking too much?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you use that expression, shut up and dribble. I directed and produced a documentary series a couple of years ago called Shut Up and Dribble.
Yep.
And, I'm a big believer, like I sort of started, like, sports is a language. So I'm not one of those people who's like, sports is over here and politics is over there, or religion is over here. Sports is the language through which we talk about, and we have historically. So, shut up and dribble, that expression, comes from a couple of years ago, Laura Ingraham telling LeBron James to shut up and dribble. But LeBron follows in the lineage of, Bill Russell and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, Colin Kaepernick, Megan Rapinoe, who use their platforms to talk about things, from civil rights to equal pay. We just have a new series out called The World According to Football with Trevor Noah, who who uses football or soccer, the world's most popular sport, as the language or the lens through which to talk about, some of the existential issues going on all over the planet. So, this has been part of our history, is to use sports, Jesse Owens, Billie Jean King, to talk about some of the big social issues in this country and really all over the world. So, and sports and spirituality. It's like also, one of the things, I know we're jumping around, but I
love it.
Work with a ton of athletes who come to me and say, hey, I'm struggling. It's the intensity of the pressure, social media, the scrutiny, the fans. Like now fans are interacting directly with athletes on their social media platforms. So, they hear the haters and, some Draymond Green and I work together. Draymond's known for all of his emotional outbursts, et cetera. And Draymond's like, hey, I heard about this thing called meditation. Can you help me? What is this thing? So, I introduced him to my dad stuff. So I think a lot of athletes are now looking for those ways to find that balance. And, I think that's a great thing. And by the way, it also helps them in performance, and so, LeBron James talks very openly, I think he endorses calm, but he uses mindfulness as a practice that obviously is also helping him, whatever year 21 of his incredible career. So sports is a really interesting language, both on the social issue side, the spiritual. I think it's part of the fabric of who we are.
Is that the reason that you wrote a book? Like, what's the package of a book is so different than your other storytelling experiences, and leaving, having a career as a visual artist and also having written books. I'm wondering if for you, was it just a different package? Was it why the book, and what did you feel like was easier for you, or a better vehicle, and what was more difficult and a worse vehicle between those two different disciplines?
I think, the book is a way of codifying in some ways the people always ask me, like we're talking about here, it's like, oh, what have you observed? What have you seen in common? What are the things that make, these athletes great and stuff? And, sometimes we're, especially, we're with this company, Religion of Sports, like producing all this stuff and moving so fast. And the book was a way to sort of like pause and observe and reflect and, like I said, codify, and just have something that's like, here's, a sort of scripture, so to speak, here are some of the lessons, at a certain moment in time that have been collected over time. And so it's fun to have it out there. It's also like, books pick up, right now we're living in a world where content just comes out so fast and the algorithm just moves on. Book is something that is sort of static, but in a good way, and I think like there's, it doesn't change. Like it doesn't come and go. It doesn't appear like just in that top 10, Netflix algorithm thing, and then just move on through the churn. A book, lasts forever in some ways. And so I really enjoyed that. It's interesting because it does feel kind of like almost like an ancient art form. When you write a book, you turn in a manuscript and then 9 months goes by because that's just how long it takes to sort of print and publish a book. Like, what other world does it take that long, to sort of create content? And then, in the 9 months since that book has sort of been in the process, like the amount of stuff that has happened. I feel like I'm ready for the sequel because like there's so much more, I've learned since then. But it is fun to have. It's a great holiday gift right now. People. So I really enjoy it. And the feedback is great. You hear from a lot of people who are already reading and reflecting, have their own stories to share.
The book, for sake of the listeners and the watchers, definitely pick it up. It's called The Religion of Sports. The subhead is Navigating the Trials of Life Through the Games We Love. You get a sense of all of the things that we're talking about here are essentially captured in the book, plus a lot of insane stories about a lot of the athletes that you've mentioned. I'm curious if we can go back to your sort of creative roots for a second, because, also, as you mentioned in the book, your parents weren't sport lovers.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
one of the biggest questions, or the biggest themes for our listeners, is around how to sort of be or become the thing that you want to be in this world, despite the external pressures. Your grandparents want you to be something. There's pressure from your career counselor. And the most difficult thing is, a lot of these people, they think they have your interests in mind and trying to push you to the thing that you're supposed to be doing. Oh, you should be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant.
Yeah.
And yet the people in my tribe, they are YouTubers and filmmakers and writers and entrepreneurs and business builders. And so, those were things that were eschewed by those people who were important in their lives. And I've got to think, with your father having the career and the success that he's had in a very, very different space, that you faced some of this. You talked about it in the book. Like, you weren't raised in a sports loving family. And yet, as you said earlier, there you were in the heart of Boston, in the epicenter of one of the, biggest sports cities in America. So what was it like pursuing your passion in a world where it was a challenge or different?
Yeah, I was really fortunate because, on the one hand, my parents were immigrants. My father's like sort of the classic immigrant story of coming to this country with very, little money in his pocket, and having, and part of why I, grew up in a world where I sort of became obsessed with sports, was because my father wasn't around. Like, he was working all the time. He was working in 2 hospitals, moonlighting at night, working in the emergency room, just earning a living. And so, I don't really have memories of my father sort of playing catch with me in the front yard, or coming to my basketball games, or taking me to Celtics games. He did have a friend who had season tickets. And so that's how I sort of got exposed to, the Celtics, who were great, in the 80s when I was growing up in Boston. And then, I think what happened with my father is, like I said, when I was a teenager and he started to have, he found his purpose. And one of the things he sort of talks about is, like, it took him 40 plus years in his life to find the thing that he was most passionate about, and then practice it. And so as I was growing up, he was like, follow your passion. So yeah, he wasn't particularly a lover of sports, but he could see it that I was, and fostered that, and encouraged me. And so I, contrary to the popular belief, of immigrants, they want their kids to become, physicians or lawyers or tradesmen or whatever. It's like, I actually was pushed to be, no, like, find the thing that you're most passionate about and follow it. My grandmother, used to tell us when we were growing up, me and my cousins, she would say, worship the goddess of knowledge, Sarasvati, and then Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity, will become jealous and follow you. And so I remember that to this day. Find the thing that you're passionate about, pursue the knowledge, and then success will follow you. And so that's just sort of the culture that I was raised around. And, it took me a while. Like I said, I thought sports was a thing that I was a fan for a long time. And it was a personal thing. It wasn't really a professional thing. It took time and experience and trial and error and failure before, like, I got it. And I got lucky. I got really lucky. I was very fortunate also with my father, and then, the success he had, and sort of the network that opened up for me. But I also, the same thing I was saying earlier about, like, these great athletes and their just relentless, work ethic. Like, I saw that in my father. Like, I saw it, like, he never, ever stopped, and he was always working, and, just like the grit that went with it. So it's something that I've seen, like you said earlier, there's sports, there's creative, there's entrepreneurial, and like a lot of the component parts of success are the same. Like it's the same, and it's something I've really tried to observe and apply in my own life.
You mentioned, this is a selfish question now. You mentioned failure as a very key vector for folks like Serena. It wasn't the 23 that she won; it was the 11 she lost. Same with Tom. I'm writing about failure. I have a book due that's on due the 31st of December. So here we are. That we're recording this on the 12th of December. So the paint that I'm in right now. I'm wondering if you can talk about the themes of how, in your experience, the world's greatest athletes deal with failure. You mentioned that, sure, they use them.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, can we scratch a little deeper? Like, how do they actually use them? And it's easy to talk about failure, losing the Super Bowl, for example, or not, whatever. It's the Jordan quote, like, it's not the 32 games I won, it's the 20, the 84 I lost trying to take the last shot at the game. But, having done all of this documentary work and been very, very close to this, what do you see? How if you were going to give advice to our audience, what did the best in the world do with failure that other people don't?
Well, yeah. So, a couple of years ago, we produced a series called Greatness Code, which lives on Apple Plus, and it's really it's a short form content, but it's basically the best athletes on the planet. So LeBron James and Tom Brady and Simone Biles and others, Steph Curry, who tell you the story of their greatest performance or their most memorable one, the one that in their minds, it's like, this is when I was in peak performance flow state. But one of the things I noticed is every time they started to tell that story, they would say, before I tell you that story, let me tell you about the time I fell flat on my face when everybody was watching and I just didn't have it. Like I missed the game winning shot. I missed, Kobe Bryant talks about, the 4 air balls he shot in a playoff game in his rookie year and how formative it was. The great ones use that as a catalyst. First of all, they sit in the pain. Like they don't just move on, but they sit in the pain and they sort of but then they sort of let it go and move on and learn. I remember once, being with Kobe and I was watching a basketball game. I'm not going to name names, but we were watching a game and this guy shot 0 for 9 in the first half. And then in the second half, his second half, at the end of the game, his stat line read 0 for 9, meaning he didn't take a shot in the second half. And Kobe said to me, he goes, bro, I would go 0 for 49 before I stopped shooting. That guy psyched himself out. And, Kobe used to always say, is the greatest competitor is myself. And I'm not going to lose to myself. And so it's just that ability to sort of sit in the pain, observe, but then learn from it and move on. And there's actually a mechanics to that. And so I always just found that really fascinating, that ability. Michael Strahan talks about this a lot. He's I got to a point in my career that physically, I knew what I had to do. It was sort of mentally, could I, deal with failure? Could I sort of pick myself up? And, that's what I learned later in my life. And if you look at Michael Strahan's, career statistics, it's later in his career that he was sort of, his Hall of Fame stats kicked in. And so it's that ability to sort of emotionally, mentally navigate, the sort of challenges, the failures that I think really define greatness. Shaun White, was sort of an Olympian, and he talks about this, during the Olympic trials, it's in that Greatness Code series, he talks about just going out and completely messing up everything. And he's like, what I found? I got back up for the second. He's like, it was do or die. And I just was F it, letting go, let go of okay, that was bad. What did I do wrong? But now let me just let go of it. Let me be reborn. And, and then he has this incredible performance and he obviously qualifies for the Olympics and goes on to win a gold medal. But it's actually that moment of failure that becomes the catalyst for greatness. And I think that's what the great ones do.
Wow. So we've got all these examples of greatness, and yet it's still absolutely elusive because it's alchemy, right? It's not a formula. It's like 2 parts eye of newt, 1 part leg of lizard.
Yeah.
It's this very sort of ephemeral, fleeting thing. Can you put a couple of pins in these things? The unexpected ones. We've talked about the willingness to fail, to sort of look funny in front of your friends, or to fall on your face. We've talked about the hard work. I don't think they would surprise anyone if you ask, how many 3-pointers has Steph Curry shot? He's probably shot more than any person in the world, which is probably why he's, the best in the world at shooting the basketball. But are there any hidden ones, or is there any theme to things that people that are not on the surface that you've experienced in your sort of that tie? And I'm thinking of this, like, these are the things that tie in your world. This is why it's a religion. There's something that's so deep and so fundamental, but unexpected. Going to church every day on Sunday, that you could see that that's spiritual or whatever. Knowing the scriptures or whatever. But what are the building blocks that people don't?
Yeah, so it's actually, in my experience and observation, it's a lot less mystical than that. Like the expression of, the moment of peak performance and flow state, it is magical when you see it as a fan, or certainly when you experience it as an athlete. Like it has all the, the hallmarks, right? Like time slows down, and it's total silence, and you become one with the game, or whatever, however athletes describe it, or even fans who are like, in the moment, and sort of lose all sense outside of, just like what's happening on the pitch or whatever. But actually, when you think of like, what's the formula for getting there? Like, what are some of the common coding, so to speak? One of the things I've observed with the great athletes, and a lot of times it happens later in their careers, right? Like they've obviously had a lot of experience, but they're more in touch with their bodies. Physically, maybe they can't do what they once did, because just as we all get older, those limitations kick in. So they become a lot more conscious of like, okay, like, well, what are the things, that I need to do to optimize myself so that I can reach that moment of flow state more often? It's things like sleep, like recovery. So recovery, like, like how do you let your body and your mind, recover? So sleep is a critical element. There's now a lot of data around all of this sort of stuff. Again, not exactly shocking, diet and nutrition. Like, how do I like give myself the fuel, like to be able to perform at the highest level? Movement. So again, this goes to recovery. Tom talked about this endlessly. I've witnessed so many, pliability. LeBron James talks about this, like what he does on his off days to sort of work on his body to enable himself to perform at the highest level. Then the two other, which are a little bit more ephemeral, we talked a little bit about, mindfulness, meditation, but a lot of athletes are now like, oh, I need silence. I need to get away from, I need to get off of social media. I need to get out of like just all the noise, so how do I do that? Well, it's, there's practices like meditation, mindfulness. It's sort of removing yourself from just all the craziness of the world. And then the last one is relationships. It's like, what are the sort of who are the, who do I surround myself with? And, there are people who take energy, and there are people that give energy. I don't know him personally, but one of the things you see with LeBron James right now in year 21 is like, he seems to have a pretty harmonious family life. He's at his kids' basketball games. He's taught, he posts stuff all the time with his wife. Like there's stability there. I saw this with Tom Brady, like I saw like when times are good, like everything, and when he was winning Super Bowls, like there was a reason. There was sort of tranquility, like life is complicated, and it's hard, but relationships is a big part of like having that success and reaching flow state, is having, like you said, harmony, and I think that's those are the sort of 5 pillars or 5 key components that I think help optimize performance.
Are there any pillars, hallmarks, DNA clues that we wouldn't want as non-elite athletes for these other areas of our lives?
Yeah.
Or are all of these, is this language, to use your word, the language of sports, is it truly universal? Or are there some characteristics that don't translate well?
Well, I think, we talked a little bit about it earlier. It's like obsession is dangerous, and, becoming so obsessed. So greatness at all costs, there's a consequence to that. And I
Yeah.
think, a danger to that. And so I think that's something to be sort of mindful of, and like we were saying, I think we're living in a time right now where we're also exposed to so much more. A lot of like what we were talking about, like all these things that are now traceable. Like we wear our Oura rings and our watches and stuff like that. And they all, measure. Like we can sort of measure this stuff. So, but I think that the danger is also, look, by the way, the big danger in all of this is social media, is like sort of becoming so buried in the noise that, we lose ourselves. And I think that's, something, again, try to stay really mindful of. But no, I think it is pretty translatable. Success is, the thing I love about sports, as a filmmaker, obviously, is like it's cinematic. Like it's physical. Like you can see when it's happening. You can see when an athlete is reaching flow state. You can feel it. And so a lot of that same stuff, I mean, we all go through this, right? We get so buried in our work, we lose a sense of time. Like this hour has flown by because I don't think we're in it.
Yes,
we're not thinking about the future or the past. We're in it. And so I think, but it's not as cinematic necessarily, but it's the same fundamental experience of losing time, becoming one with the experience. And so, I sort of am fortunate. I love what I do. And, I love sort of talking about this stuff and really engaging with people. And so, but I think it's a lot of the same DNA.
Congrats again on the book. It's The Religion of Sports, Navigating the Trials of Life Through the Games That We Love. What's next? I mean, you've been insanely prolific for the last decade specifically, but your whole career, like you mentioned something about whether it was intentional or not, spending time with Serena now. So you're clearly working on something, but presumably others as well. Is there anything you can tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole bunch of projects here. So the company that I started, whatever, 7 or 8 years ago, called Religion of Sports, has a number of amazing filmmakers and editors and producers and writers and artists and stuff like that. So yeah, we have a project with Serena that we're working on right now. It'll be, we did a couple of years ago this project called Man in the Arena with Tom Brady. And that one was easy because there were like 10 Super Bowls and 10 episodes. Serena and her 34 Grand Slam finals has presented quite a challenge. You sort of can that down into
not too many series of 34, right?
Our friends at Disney are not, willing to let us do 34 episodes. So we're, working with them. But that's a big thing that we're working on. It'll come out in the summer. It's called In the Arena. It's Serena Williams, or as we like to call it, Serena in the Arena. And so that'll launch. But yeah, we have a number of different projects, working with other sort of athletes. But, I'd say the thing that I'm really enjoying now is like actually getting to work with other creators. I mean, Serena's amazing, obviously, but it's like the 10, 15, creative people that are working alongside me that I get to mentor now and learn from. I really enjoy that. So, this building that I'm in right now has 40 odd people who work here day in, day out. And it's a lot of like what we're building together and getting to do. So yeah, we like the Trevor Noah thing that came out, I think like 10 days ago. That's
congrats on that.
So it's also just like being part of a creative community and doing some special stuff.
Anywhere else you would steer our listeners and watchers to learn a little bit more? Besides the book, of course, we're very good buyers and supporters of our authors and artist friends, creative friends. But anywhere else you'd want to steer our attention?
Like, I mean, it was a really interesting experience, sort of chronicled a little bit in the book, working with Conor McGregor. Like, he's the other
Oh
extreme.
yeah, yeah.
And
I
like,
used to think you called it difficult or something
yeah,
like that in there. I remember.
challenging for sure.
Challenging. That's right. Challenging.
So,
There you go.
but it was a great series that ended up on Netflix a couple months ago. So that's out there. But yeah, our content, you can still go back to the ESPN platform and find the Man in the Arena or Tom versus Time. So there's it's all over the place. The best place to go is our website, religionofsports.com, and it'll direct you to all the different places. But I'm also it's also not just our content. There's great stuff out there, and I'm a storyteller, and I love great storytelling. I also one of the things we talk a lot about here is Joseph Campbell, Hero of a Thousand Faces. Those
Hero's
are
journey.
and going back to the basics. And as we live in this crazy world of like social media and TikTok and Instagram and like stuff like that, like it's so easy to get caught up in the sort of delivery platform and like this, but it's going back to great storytelling, and no matter how the form changes or the delivery method changes, storytelling still is sort of at the epicenter of it. And storytelling is a craft. It's not like it's like sports. You don't just wake up one day and like achieve greatness. It's like you got to put in the work. You got to learn the skills. You have to practice over and over again. And so there's some great stuff out there that we try to remind ourselves, like, go back to the basics.
Well, you were also very clear about community, and one I think an interesting point for us to maybe wrap up on is this idea that like, you have the community of your interest focus, which is sports, right? And then you also have your community of creators. Mm-hmm. And it's in that overlapping Venn diagram, the people who create amazing work around the shared idea, the shared topic of sports. Like those are really your people. So how can you seek those people out? And I'm sure it's quite fun to be there in your studios, sitting around a bunch of people who geek out on this stuff. And congrats for pulling on that thread and finding something that you love. We all benefit a lot from you being happy and excited and continuing to put out more work. So thanks again for being on the show. The Religion of Sports, get the book, folks. It's fantastic. And again, consider yourself a guest on the show whenever you want, whenever you got more stuff coming out. And until next time, thank you very, very much. And to everybody out there, from Gotham and myself, we bid you a great day.